talk. I'm talking. It's time for our rumors and gossip. I know I had an exciting week, but I'm opening up for anyone here who has something not necessarily fourth to share with us before I launch. So please.
Can you do a quick update on
yes, the 11:30 time.
get the screen down, because this way you can see it.
Well, then let that be the last, because we will lower the screen and turn on the gizmo all at once and introduce the act. You get no introduction. Nobody gets an introduction. Introduce yourself. That's the... Anyway. Well then, in the morning session, which you may already have watched because it's on tape, and this is on tape, we spoke about how difficult the three-body problem is. There's an analog that I will resurrect briefly called the three-body problem expressed in farts. In a room with no body, no problem. And when I'm alone, well, mine smell like flowers, so also no problem. When two people are in the room and you have perfect knowledge of who farts, but when there are three people in the room, it is not you don't know. Three-body problem. A runner. Here is pavement. Here is sand and pavement. The runner can run about 10 meters per second because he is pretty quick. On pavement, we'll call it 4 meters per second on the sand. And he starts at this marker here, and he ends at this marker here. Of course, because he's smart, he knows that he's going to cut up a little bit, and then cut down a little bit, and cut back again, because he wants to minimize the time in getting... Now, what makes light so smart that if this were optical densities, light knows how to go there? We were talking about why does... Of course, there's a map that knows it. John, hi, John. Why is light so smart?
It's because of the wave nature of light.
Indeed it is.
Do that. Photon nature...
See? Light is a wave.
No.
Oh, I know, I'm sorry. Anyway.
We don't know exactly what it is. We know that it has wave-like attributes. We know that it has particle attributes.
Very good.
So that what you're saying here is...
because the wave front is slowing, the wave...
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the properties of the mass that affect the wave,
or the space.
Yeah,
we'll call it.
that. Yeah.
So the idea of why does light know how fast to go? Why did the runner has to work out in advance, because we are not nature. Nature. All right, we've been pedestrians since how long? We've gradually learned to arm ourselves. And our weapons technology has tragically exceeded our social technology. And so today, children, bless them, especially those with recent traumatic experiences, are sharing their desire for a safe place. Boy, is that ringing a bell so resonantly. Kim Commando this morning suggested it's about time we had special lanes for autonomous vehicles. We got pedestrian lanes, we got bicycle lanes, we got this. Well, similarly, the idea of machine intelligence, to what end? The idea of safety, to what end? That is, do we want to be human beings? Or do we want to just be safe? Do we want that blue pill? Because if we're willing to tear down our humanity, we can make ourselves safe. The process of getting safe will cost probably many more lives than a generation of lone nuts.
Yes.
But if we are to inherit at least some niche in the cosmos, we had better learn about what makes us human and learn to love it and each other because we are past the point of disarmament and maintaining our humanity. And that's my rumors and gossip for the afternoon. Now, please.
Now, you brought up a good point about light.
I see, the science part always gets me.
Okay, here's some things that to know about light. If you have an atom that is excited, means the thing, right? Right?
The electrons.
Okay. And that
Thank you,
atom
Andres.
emits a photon, we'll never know it. We cannot know when a photon gets emitted. We only
Very good.
know when it gets absorbed.
So far, we don't know that. And,
We
and
can,
it may
we
be,
can, we can determine, you
right,
know,
right. We may never be able to know when an atom's electrons lose or gain their energies.
well, no, we can know when it loses. Or no, we don't know when it loses. We just know that when it gains.
Ah,
Because we have detectors called our eyes.
well, we
And
we can tell the energy from the atom when it radiates that energy.
Yeah, but that means it has to be absorbed
Right,
first.
right. So we can tell when it loses because.
No, you're inferring.
Well, okay. See, we can infer the loss of energy
Exactly.
because we perceive the gain of energy.
Gain of energy. Now remember, that photon can be coming as, you're like what, a meter away from me?
Yeah, about a nanosecond.
Yeah,
worth,
3 nanoseconds. There you
Oh,
go.
wait a minute.
Okay. Now what happens if you're at the edge of the universe, 13.8 billion light years away, and all of a sudden I get a photon that was emitted from you? How long did it take? Well, that depends. From our point of view, it took 13.8 billion years to get here.
Yeah.
But if you're riding on the photon, no time.
Apparently, no time passes on it if you're riding on the light wave. If you are light, you may not experience time,
Yes.
and that's
Now, if you look at the special theory of relativity,
yes, we do.
now if you were to try to follow this photon, which is probably very hard to do.
Let's go ahead and do it.
When you start getting up closer and closer to the speed of light, the point at which the photon was emitted and the point where it gets absorbed,
Shrink like crazy.
it gets shrunk down. So that if you take it to the limit at the speed of light, that all space from the point of emission to the point of absorption is zero.
Zero time for the.
No.
Well-
It's zero space.
Zero
because,
space. Okay.
Yeah.
Well then, what goes on if there is time for the light in no space? Well, there it is. Is that my mystery as yet is what is time, and
Yes.
it's not just something that passes while things happen because that's just talking. But
That's the thing, because in
Why
fact, that's
time?
why it's called space-time.
yes,
Space and time are permanently locked together.
the fourth dimension of the hypotenuse, your x, y, and z squared plus time squared.
Well, no, it's minus ICT.
Well, what if the sum of your spatial and time velocities were the speed of light? Want to break?
Here we go. What you're looking at.
By the way, we're just doing a silent movie here. Can we be on here?
No, you got audio.
Okay, great. You have audio. I have audio,
As long
but
as
does
you-
John have
As
audio?
long as you stand close enough.
Close enough. So very good. Yeah. Very good.
That's a constant.
Right.
That's
And
what?
It is
Increment.
these are all variable given these
Yeah, the increments of space
and time.
and time.
They add up to the speed of light, so that your time will necessarily slow by an itsy bit if you start running. But if you take off like an electron zoom, you will necessarily lose some time vector in your experience. Your time will pass more slowly because the sum of your space and time vectors must add up to the square of the speed of light.
Don't you also have to lose mass to accomplish that?
Well, to the accomplishing, that's
Or
not
you gain
important.
mass.
They just say,
gain
yeah,
mass.
Well, your mass expands.
you wish you could.
Sort of.
You wish you could.
It'll slow you down. Your mass slows
Well,
you
you won't,
down.
no, it will impede your further acceleration.
That's the
Yeah,
point, yes.
yeah. And,
You have to shed mass to get there.
well, unfortunately,
Thankfully,
you
photons
can't,
have no mass.
yeah,
Yes,
That-
that's why they can do it.
photons, well, apparently, they have no rest mass. I don't know if they do or they don't, because I've never seen one standing still.
Yeah, that's a good
That's
point.
the other
There's no
point.
rest.
Mathematically,
Well,
okay,
yes,
now,
you have seen one, but they're constantly bombarding you. You can't detect one.
it's when they're standing still. They don't stand still. So please, John, interpret these next lines and your vector.
Okay. Special theory of relativity. We've got two things. Beta, which is the ratio of the relative velocity to the speed of light. And we have gamma, which is 1 over the square root of 1 minus beta. Okay? So that, I got this right.
That's Lorentz contraction.
That's right. I'm trying to go from memory. So that here, when beta starts approaching 1, this becomes infinite.
Well, small. Small
Well-
denominator, very large number.
Yeah, so gamma will become large. So if this is large and you divide by it, length, okay,
All right?
that's the contraction. This is the extension. So you can see this becomes
Again, large.
zero. No, this is 0. No,
It's large.
no. That. Is that right? No, it's infinite. No, it's
Right,
infinite.
right.
This goes to zero. So. I'm trying to remember it. There, this is, I'm trying to shake loose the cobwebs
Yeah,
upstairs.
Goes from gamma
goes to,
infinity.
Right.
Yeah, this means when you've got beta here, goes to 1, that means, this goes to 1, that goes to infinity. You divide by infinity.
Yeah,
Yeah, time.
goes to 0.
Yes, yes,
T goes to infinity.
yes. Yeah, this will go, right, that's it. Okay? So what I'm saying is, what happens, what does you have an atom that's excited, you have another atom that's neutral, and it's an L length apart. If this emits, if this atom emits a photon and it gets absorbed here, what I'm trying to say is, do you have to have a destination for a photon? Once it gets emitted,
But you have a probability function.
that's right.
Yeah,
See?
you have certain probability that it will reach N.
That is to say, if there's just one electron and one proton in the whole universe, and that's it, where does the energy come from to raise or lower it? So
Yeah, see,
you have to have some assumption that you have a populated universe. Once you have a populated universe, you can discuss the probability that a photon emitted will eventually find a target. But until then, that photon could be on its way to some place where it would have gone if nothing intervened, and something can intervene.
You're
The
assuming
idea
that
that-
it's
of-
going to be in the same dimension, right?
Well, changes do happen. And the idea that you can say, well, all of change is encompassed within the same universe. It's all predetermined. And there's your metaphysics is what is determined and what is up to decision.
Determination is only a probability.
That's
Well,
exactly
okay,
right.
okay.
And the wave function just describes that probability. You cannot predict any one photon would fall. But if you have doing the same thing a million times, then you can find a probability that will hit.
That's, exactly.
You can put your money on
It could be
a
this.
zillion.
Don't put your money on it.
Well, no, not on one. no.
Yeah, this could be, now, that our universe has an edge,
We
an
both,
end.
well, does it have an
That
edge or
if you
is it?
I don't know.
Well,
We don't know,
well,
but that's what's happening, meaning
there is a
if I look off this
possibility.
way and I come to the edge, all of a sudden I start looking here.
Yeah, that's not the edge.
Does it move?
That is,
Does it move?
we could be on a three-dimensional surface of a fourth-dimensional sphere.
Exactly.
With a final, and I'm still looking for the math because I want a video game, but I lack the math to get the players into a three-dimensional surface rather than a three-dimensional open space. Because all the idea of going off the edge of the map and so on, it's relatively easy on 2 dimensions to create
That's what
a
I'm
spherical
saying right there.
space.
When you look at that space, the
Yes.
space-time diagram, that really we are on a
Well, we're
a fourth-dimensional sphere.
until that dark matter showed up, we had a pretty good idea that gravity would ultimately win, because it's the one thing that you can't put up a shield. I'll put up this gravity shield, and unfortunately it's made of matter and it's got gravity. So that all the titanic forces of the nucleus, they peter out. Gravity just keeps on ticking. But now with this dark stuff, that the loneliness bit, when stuff gets far enough apart, it starts to lose interest in its neighbor. That could mean an open-ended universe.
Oh, the dark energy, yeah.
Yeah, and so right now we're back to the, is it an oscillating universe? Is it a closed, crashing universe? Is it an open-ended universe?
And not only that, but we're finding that the expansion of the universe is getting faster again.
You notice, and that's that damn darkness. As soon as you discover some reason for it to speed up, suddenly it starts speeding up. You know, damn it, like fractals. Before we knew what fractals were, you know, suddenly we see fractals everywhere. Look at that. Yeah, that's fractals.
Yes, that's why the assumption, because what they use for a yardstick is a type 1A supernova.
In Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah, no, it's a star that has a certain
that
mass
guy.
when it reaches 1.4,
So many masses.
that it will become a supernova. And usually those are binary systems where you have mass transfer from one star to another, usually to the smaller star. As it's getting heavier and heavier and heavier, when it reaches 1.4 solar masses, it becomes a supernova. So they're saying, okay, if that's true, then we can use those as a
Yardstick, okay.
Exactly. So that's why they're going, okay, when you do all the math, and you go, I see this, I can tell by the shape of the decay curve, and its peak magnitude, I can say, oh, if that's what its observed magnitude is, then I can infer what the distance that star is, and that supernova is. And then you can say, oh, that thing's going away. And also from spectroscopic analysis, you can find out what its speed of recession is.
How is speed of recession different from the speed of going away?
It's the same thing.
Oh, okay, very good. Yes, you can.
Yes.
We have a right the Doppler shift of okay.
But you also have to make sure that what you're observing, there's no ISM, interstellar matter like dust and gas and things like that that tend to redden things, make them appear dimmer and redder than they
Well,
are.
it amplifies.
It's an all one.
Yeah, but just putting more red in there doesn't shift the lines of,
No, but it changes the spectrum. It changes the relative spectrum. So,
I did not
oh
hear
yeah,
that,
yeah,
okay.
reddening.
Oh, that it doesn't just add red color, it also moves those emission
Well, it doesn't
lines?
move the lines.
Oh, all
It
right.
that's why you look
Oh,
at
so
the
you-
line. But, like I said, it's a long involved process that you have to go through to determine, especially when they're way, and they're moving way faster.
I am so glad for rumors and gossip. And now, let's lower the boom and bring on the update on the project. Call it Project 40, Project 1130, Project... Hell, if you ever want to read something scary, Project 40 or Hellstrom's Hive. Hellstrom's Hive or Project 40. It came out as Project 40, kind of like the Foreman Project became Colossus. That sold better. So Hellstrom's Hive
Oh, is that
sold...
Astro Chronicles? Remember that?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, well, there's a subsequent about the Hellstrom Project. Here is the...
In standby.
Oh, no, it's like when you put it in your pocket, that's actually a button that mutes the microphone. That's probably what,
This?
yeah, that's a mute button.
Something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Well, the computer can hear you. At least it's putting the bar across that's moving. We can hear you too.
All right, we're just going to go over some basic practices of backups that I've kind of, since I've crashed a lot of computers, been in the data recovery industry for over, 12 years, and kind of heard a lot of horror stories, and, through that you develop your own practices to save your own data. So we'll get to that, but let's start off with backing up as best practices. There is a reason why you have backup, because the thing is, you will always have to have more than one source of data over time because things fail. Doesn't matter if it's an SSD, hard drive, or cloud-based stuff. So you want to make sure you protect whatever you believe is important over time. So these are some of the sayings I kind of just scarfed off the internet, which are quite interesting, as you can see. You can read these for yourself. The best one I always like is the fact that having two backups is great, but a lot of people always say, I made a copy of it, right? Well, that's great, but eventually that could die. And I've seen that on so many occasions where somebody's backup drive where they only had one copy, and it was devastating. A lot of people in the wedding industry, people who do family photography, just do a lot of photos. They always put it on one drive and everything's organized, and it one day it doesn't boot. So always replicate is always the key.
And or that the device that you copied it to, that it goes into a drive, that drive doesn't exist anymore. They don't make them.
How do you mean?
8-inch floppies.
Oh, are you talking about you're talking about the archive device that you're, right. There are, strange enough, there are still companies that are actually producing 8-inch floppies. There are still floppy disks. Of course, floppy media degrades over time based on who the manufacturer was and the particular run that it goes through.
Same thing with CDs and DVDs.
True. The thing is, each one has a long-term longevity and integration, especially with the USB floppies and the USB CD-ROMs and DVDs. They still will provide, 10, from this point on, you're probably looking at easily 10 years plus more existence before. Obviously, the flash world is taking on, that particular job right now, USB flash drives. And they're a lot different than your standard SSD models, right? There's two different chips. And so, but the thing is, they still have degradation, which you have to really take into account. So these are things you hear all the time, excuses of people who just don't take the time or believe it's really too difficult. It takes a little bit of knowledge to do, to save your information. And when people just don't take the time, they just believe, like the second one, nothing will ever go wrong, right? Exactly. It works today, it will work tomorrow. Well, why worry? That's great. I love that. But then, we get into problems. Then you get into the danger zone. You have no plan, no backup, things happen. You get too busy in life, and that's unfortunate. Here's some analysis of basically people in the industry. I know it's a little bit of fuzz in some of these areas over here. Basically, this is human error, software, computer virus, natural disasters, and hardware malfunctions. So their basic statistics are pretty good. As far as, loss due to things out of your control. So that means there's a lot of stuff in your control that you can actually do to preserve your data. Here's some basic disaster statistics for, home and business. You can pretty much do the same analysis where businesses who do not back up their data can actually go out of business. And if you hire somebody that doesn't know what the hell they're doing, you could be out of business, both from a hardware perspective, as far as doing the restore, to the backups of where they're located, either on-site or off-site.
Same thing happened. You remember Dennis and Sleep Number?
John?
Yes, where a cloud service got hacked. Yeah, and luckily Sleep Number had was using also another service, but there were other companies that went literally right out of business because that cloud service got hacked and they lost their data. And I mean, it was like that. It's like they just came to work and went, oh, backup's gone, our cloud service is gone. Go home. Yeah, go home. Yeah, why? We don't exist anymore.
Yeah, well, those are the unfortunate dangers when you hand off your things that are your responsibility over to another service. But, I mean, that is part of the fabric of what we're dealing with today. So we have to kind of look forward to a little bit more, hybridized systems. And I think that will be seen in due time. So if you don't back up, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to basically burn down in flames, just like John was saying, that people will go out of business, and you'll be praying for people to say, where's our backup? Help us do the restore. And that's where, things cost money, time, and both for personal businesses, entrepreneurs, coders, anybody who's in the industry that they have to deal with. So most of this presentation primarily is obviously for the home user. These are the most common media types that people are looking to maintain over a period of time for one reason or another. For archival purposes. A lot of this stuff can be rotated out if the individual or company has a particular policy on, data for like drafting. Some keep it, for the existence of the company if they plan on selling it off for future companies, or even individual contractors. They can maintain archival data for all their pictures, for people who do appraisals on the side. Just a lot of stuff. But the main thing is people accumulate a huge amount of information, primarily in music, videos, and movies, primarily. The other pictures, depending upon your megapixel, of course, can take up just as much space, so that has to be looked into as well. So basically what you choose depends upon you as far as what's important, what's the overall size of the data, how much do you plan on spending. As far as like what is upfront, right? Upfront is anything that is local backups that you're planning on implementing, or cloud for the people that, want a really simple, non-invasive type of backup system that they don't have to set up. They can just pay for it and just let it run. But if there's local, there are general rules to that storage. I call it a 3 times rule, basic on your data size. And basically you're looking at, when you're looking at the current size of your information, right? That means the total disk size, not just your data primarily, is if you're currently, your OS takes up 250 gig plus your data, definitely have a terabyte drive, because you're just looking at obviously growing that data over a period of time. It's usually relatively slow based on the type of job you're doing. Then, of course, imaging, you want to triple that because you're dealing with multiple images, so you want to make sure that you have backups of that image and it rotates them out over time. And then, of course, you want to take things offline so that it's not always running. You can always leave one attached if you like. Storing stuff on USBs, just as an example, 25 gig worth of data. You want to get a 64 gig because you're going to basically double. Then you want to buy 2 more of the same type, because usually if you have to go into any data recovery for whatever reason and you have critical data on one, you want similar flash drives so that if you need to sacrifice that to a hard drive repair facility, they can usually use that, or they can just pull it off the chip with newer technology that they have today. But it's always good to have 2 additional, because you never know if those are going to fail due to static electricity, plugging them in. The chipset may, get damaged, or the flash may get screwed up. So there's different backup types, and I was doing some research on this, and this was kind of confusing because they mainly talk about full incremental differential, and I've got an explanation on all the different types. But there are more programs that are coming out that are doing real-time file synchronization. Of course, imaging is being put into programs like Acronis, True Image, Markham Reflect, and a lot of these other softwares that are out there that provide that. And of course, archiving is obviously long-term storage, data on tapes, CDs. Primarily, you can do spinning drives or USB sticks. Notice I didn't mention SSDs, because SSDs, when they're not powered up, have a decay factor. So you can't use those for long-term storage without powering them up at least every 3 to 6 months.
You know why?
Yeah.
Because inside an SSD, the storage media is NAND flash. NAND flash is very inexpensive to use, but it doesn't last too long. So that, like, if you get a 1 terabyte SSD, well, the flash on there will probably be 2 terabytes. And then as the sectors start,
Well, you're talking about basically a different thing than standard decay of the media itself.
that's what I'm talking about. is
No,
decay of the media.
No. You're talking about basically replacement for bad cells,
Yeah, that's
right?
my point is to say that SSDs are not permanent.
No, yeah, I'm talking about actual decay. If you took, it's not the same thing.
Data is decaying, yes.
Well,
That's what I'm saying.
I'm talking about in a non-powered state, okay? That means that if there's no charge to maintain on the substrate, it will basically go away. You'll get bit error. But that's different than, reallocation. Okay, reallocation just says that you have a bad sector or a bad bit for whatever reason, then it will move that data prior to that. That's why, actually, if you look on any hard drive, it will move it.
Well, it will move. You've got.
This is the same technology that has been around since hard drives existed, because you always have to have reallocation, because especially as these drives get larger, your error rate goes higher, right? So you need to be able to move that data from those prospective bad sectors that are there to a good sector, and then it just realigns the bits on the disk.
I worked at Micron Technology
So,
on an SSD, testing the firmware.
yeah.
And I brought that question up. I said, what happens when the sector goes bad? He said, SOL.
Not true.
Wait, see, can the sector go, irrespective of where the data goes bad, will the hardware go bad in a power down state?
Yes.
Yes. For SSDs?
Or SSDs? So,
Eventually, yes.
so even in a power down state, irrespective of the data, you will just get old so it becomes unusable even if you're not using it.
No, the energy in the state
So,
goes away.
so if you're using it, then the device detects the early onset of failure and reallocates space.
Right, just like all hard drives.
At a power down state, hardware is not vulnerable, but your data is vulnerable to erosion.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Whereas if you had a regular hard drive on magnetic media, that's more stable,
Oh, yeah.
right?
More stable. Not
So
stable,
just-
more. Less unstable.
Just to clarify, I think what's being discussed most frequently here is the concept of wear leveling, where you have limited number of writes, because the MOS transistors implementing the NAND flash will be stressed when you actually program those transistors.
Actually, when you erase.
When you erase, correct.
You erase.
What I think John is describing is electron leakage
Yes.
from the gate of the flash. They're two different things. This behaves like a dynamic RAM. So the transistor doesn't get damaged, it just loses its program.
Yes. Which means
Right.
it could be cognitive.
Now, with the newer SSDs that they're coming out with this 3D stuff, which is like,
That's going to make it even worse. Density.
It's more on a die.
yeah, it has unknowns, and it's dealing with states slightly quantumish in this nature,
That's what I mean.
Yeah, so we don't really know.
What's your thought on MRAM, like magnetoresistive RAM versus ferroelectric RAM? Cypress makes ferroelectric RAM, and I think Everspin makes magnetoresistive RAM, and they both say theirs is the preferred approach.
The fashizzle.
The best one, yeah. I sort of feel like MRAM has unlimited write endurance, and
I mean,
but MRAM does not. It's more resistant. MRAM is
we need a lot more third-party hard testing on actually that versus the publications from these companies, so that it's a little bit more independent on, because places like Google, who actually go through huge amount of drives, right? Both spinning drives, SSDs. There you can actually quantify the type of failures, because every piece of media goes back to the manufacturer to figure out exactly what happened, right? There's a synergy between those industries to be able to actually see what the failure rate is, what type of failure it is over time, just because they're using so much, right? And they have a better concept of what those, that long-term storage is going to actually act like. And if we can put those in that type of environment, then you can actually see how it actually works real time, consistently 24/7 over a period of time.
Yeah, I think Everspin only recently came out with a 256 megabyte MRAM chip, so it's like pretty low density right now.
They'll fit forth, right?
I think it's 60 meg one before.
So,
Do we all know the difference between full, good, we got that, good.
yeah, so, yeah, I took some painstaking time to go through people's different definitions of what's out there. And we'll be able, obviously, provide the slides. I've got a PDF of all this, so it's easier for people to download. No. But if you would want one, I can change the slide real quick. All these actually are purposeful based on the type of data that you want to back up, how you want to back it up, and primarily the environment, right? There's the one I obviously like is between real-time, file synchronization, imaging, and archiving. You know, imaging is very similar to full, but you're actually not just doing full data. The imaging obviously is the full restoration of the OS at the time that it was created, which then of course you'll have all the file data between the real-time and synchronization of all the change data, so you can actually restore that in a faster manner.
So this is just basically taking an image of the disk, copy.
Right.
So you're starting from logical block 0, and you go through the whole media, and you copy those things to another.
Correct. But the thing is, just like all backups, they take out all the white space, and they invoke compression, so it creates a smaller image.
Okay, so it is.
So let's say if you have a 250 gig hard drive, you won't get a 250 gig image.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
If your data set is only like 20 gig, you're going to compress it to 20 gig, then or
You want
down to 20
expand it
bit.
back, it will expand back to the 250.
Correct. It'll
Okay.
put the partition back the way it was written. So that's what's. More people should do this because it just, people who are programmers or just in businesses where those particular machines are critical to development environments, small businesses that are running, just for instance, I just happened to try to do a recovery for a guy who is doing QuickBooks, right? QuickBooks has its own backup process if people don't ignore it, right? It will save you. Well, they didn't. And so the only working image they had was from 2016. All right? So that means now you have 2.5 years worth of data that have to now be re-inputted into the system, assuming that they have all the records.
Now, I know from my experience working in data centers, we used to use a tool called Norton Ghost for imaging drives and basically mass producing
Oh yeah,
server
I
deployments.
used it when it first came out.
That all changed markedly when Windows XP came out and basically rendered the approach of imaging obsolete or just impractical.
Why do you
modern
say that?
tools- Like how do these modern tools get around, for example, the serial, what's the word I'm looking for? The hardware stamping that goes on when you first install an OS, because I know that we've tried to image a version of Windows on one machine.
Oh, you're talking about driver incompatibilities and
No,
stuff
same
like that?
hardware,
Same hardware?
Same type of motherboard, just
Right.
different serial numbers on the motherboard.
Uh-huh.
Boot up Windows on one machine, ghost it, and then try to restore it on another motherboard, and the operating system dies. The only thing that's different between them are the serial numbers in the CPU, because Windows will lock itself to a specific hardware platform.
Well, it locks itself to multiple indices in the platform so that it's license compliant, right? So if too much of it changes, like between your video card, whatever it chooses, right? It will say, oh, this license is not valid, so it invalidates it, and you have to enter in a new license key, right? That's how it generally works, unless they're.
For the home version,
I'm talking about for any, unless you're doing obviously, you have a key for your entire company, right?
Well, that's what we did,
Then there shouldn't be any problem.
you would think.
Because, just under my experience, and I also taught my brother, how to mass produce, ghost disks on multiple types of systems. And, of course, all through the standard boot floppy at the time. And, we churned out hundreds of laptops, over duration time, and had literally zero problem. So I would have to look at the process that you were going through and, the switches and stuff that you were using to kind of determine that.
Yeah, we did not. Once we got to a certain version of Windows, that process stopped working for us.
Yeah. We were actually currently, strange enough today, at home I use Ghost to clone disks with on current hardware platforms today, and it works perfectly. So, and that's just from an imaging standpoint.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is just reset certain keys based on the hardware. Make sure you preload all the drivers that are very common to the hardware platforms you're dealing with, and then of course, with the internal ICH, if you're using Intel stuff, make sure you have all those, because it will cause the system to go pretty easily.
You've also got the situation that if a driver comes in, it's going to look at the exact version of that hardware and adjust its parameters appropriately. So if you take an image of that driver to another piece of hardware that's even slightly different, it won't work.
Yes, that's why you preload the driver in your image.
Correct.
And then
you load the driver in the new one.
No, as the system boots up, it will
Yes.
draw that from the driver base and say, hey, I see this.
I see I changed a little bit.
Exactly.
That's why you want to be able to have, to run things virtually.
That's nicer.
Yeah, but that's later.
But, like you said, it's the being able to have everything, including the drivers, so that they will access the thing that you're using.
Well, remember, virtualization, can run on anything. It doesn't really matter.
Remember,
It's the interface and the driver set through VMware VirtualBox that makes it compatible.
bigger and bigger and bigger. Currently, I think what you get 16 cores right now for like a laptop.
32.
32, I'm waiting to where I can have my own private cloud where I've got 1,024 cores.
Well, you can actually do that on home NASs. They actually have strong enough processors that they're putting in there now that you can, and they have VM written that you can run VMs from the NASs. They're pretty penny, right?
Oh, yeah.
Don't mind you, you're talking about several $1,000s, but
My own private cloud,
And containers to run everything.
yeah, so I can run whatever.
hey, they have the latest constant updates for companies like Synology, QNAS. They're all on the higher end markets doing these processes already. So this is the backup circle of life. Basically, your backup, you manage it, you replicate it, test it. Very important. John has
I want to
got.
know what you do with the test. So what you're saying is the backup that you have a way of verifying that it's still what it is. Is that right?
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay, good. Answer the question. Give this man a banana.
Well, there's multiple ways. Then, depending upon the method that we were looking at prior to, that will determine that verification process, right? Some of it is through the program, some of it obviously Some don't have, let's say, CRC checks. Some do have verification rights where they actually do inline, probably MD5 checks from, the source to destination, just to make sure that everything calced fine. So here's some basic best practices that you kind of can follow through here. So daily file backups, replicating your files to more than one device. If you have a NAS, great. If you have DAS, which is basically direct attached storage, similar to USBs, if you want flash drives to be that. And just have those constantly attached to your system so that it's offloading from your local system. If you're not working off your local system, you have to make sure that you're replicating whatever your target drive is for all your data. A lot of people say, oh, I don't want to write anything to my C drive because I'll use up too much space. And it's like, just clone the disk to a larger drive and then create a backup of that data, to your external, right? Happen time and time again, people do that, and then their external dies, and then they say, all my data was on the external. I wasn't writing anything to the local. It's like, I thought that was a bad thing, right? So, not so good. You want to do monthly backups, imaging. Make sure you obviously have more than one and have rotating storage. Cloud backups obviously can perform daily operations on a continuous basis because it's always monitoring as long as, of course, you have an internet connection. This is the basic setup for most home users, even businesses, just kind of micro model. Obviously, your data guard here, your external drives, you can do long-term burns to DVDs, even actually Blu-ray. You can store up to 50 gigs on one disk. It's pretty crazy. Of course, it's not cost prohibitive, but it's very rarely done, but it's doable. If you have actually photos, Blu-ray is not a bad thing because you can actually play those on any current DVD Blu-ray player that's being sold today, and that's going to probably be a standard for the next 12, 15 years out before it kind of peters out from this point. And then of course your cloud backup storage. Now, back to John's question. Check your backups. For me, when I basically image every month, right, I always make sure that the backup software verifies the backup, which obviously takes a lot more time. But it secures that you're going to get a really good image. The other thing, obviously, is all image files that are created are mountable through their software or respective software. So you can actually mount it as a drive. You can view the data as an open archive or almost like a zip. So it's pretty nice. The other thing is, obviously, it generates log files. You can actually just look and see at the end of the job, make sure it's all working. When you're dealing with other data types like your, like your full backups, that's just your data, right? So you got to make sure that you're looking at the information and looking at the logs to make sure everything's going well. Incrementals, you got to make, and differentials, both of these, you got to just make sure that those are working, because without, they're all dependent upon the full backup. both of these. So that's why I'm not really keen on these, because they're all chained back to this guy. And if this guy fails for whatever reason, if you don't have duplicates, then you could be really screwed. Or if an incremental is damaged, differentials are basically compounded versions of incrementals. So you have the full, then you have all the changes in here. But if this is damaged, then all you're left with was the full. So it's kind of all over the place. Real time is great because you save a file, it puts the file in multiple locations as you choose, whether on a NAS or USB, instantly, 30 seconds for me after I write it. So, and what's nice about this is that, yeah, it overwrites it, but you can actually have versioning as well in there. So for criticals, you set versioning on specific files that you want multiple redundancy. So file synchronization, very similar, but it's on a scheduled basis, right? So a lot of the scheduling or synchronization software I've seen, they're actually implementing real time in there as well, which is kind of cool. I've never seen that before, except for in a few pieces of software that I've looked at recently. But these will just back up and overwrite. They don't really do versioning, so depending upon the features you want, based on the critical nature of the data, you really have to look into that. But again, I say image, long-term archives, rotation, very key. Especially if you're talking about hardware incompatibility, right? Obviously, you can, as long as your hardware doesn't die, you can always restore an image back to that given hardware platform. Unless you are spending the money on bare metal restore, which then will basically take out the driver base and allow that image to be stored on anything, despite the drivers that are located there, and then you can load the drivers for that hardware platform separately.
Which we were not doing.
Right.
Oh, just real quick, when you test something, I was thinking maybe the files in the backup, you could do, say, like a SHA 512 on it and get the size so that, you know, if anything changes, you know, oh, that thing went south.
Very few do that.
Yes.
Very few, because it takes up way too much time to do the calc,
Yeah, I agree.
right? Here's just a quick list of software, basically across the Linux and Windows platforms. Some have obviously GUIs. There's a lot more that I found when I was looking into the Linux stuff that actually have GUIs that make it really simple for people getting into the Linux community to use backup software. And it's a lot more intelligent. It's versus when you're dealing with switches, you just don't really know the outcome because it's harder to read. Of course, there are some that do imaging, you notice there. Some are client server for people who have local LANs that want to do it on their own. Quick look at the cloud. And here are some basic cloud provider information that I kind of put together. You know, ones that allow support for external backups, support Linux, allows you to do multiple sets of schedules. You got version retention rates, CPU utilization on your local system to be managed. How long does their cloud service actually keep data that has been deleted versus multiple versioning? How long do they keep that? You know, continuous backup on the particular PCs based on what you pay for. The amount of storage changes from each different vendor based on the type of service you want to pay for. Encryption varies between both the transport and the stored version. So there's a disparity between, oh, it's transferring it, you know, 256 AES, but it actually only stores it as 128, right? So that's for, of course, nerds who care. And then, of course, your cost per month varies widely. Actually, SOS has a lot of good features that are quite straightforward. Carbonite's very well known. Spider Oak is actually quite nice as well. Their AES 256, both in transport and on the local storage, so that's really cool, whereas all the other ones don't do that. Glacier just melted. So, I didn't price out Glacier. It wasn't actually in any of the top home models. It was primarily...
Slow retrieval.
Well, that's because it's great for uploading long-term archiving storage, but not for pulling. This is actually for if you want actually to retrieve something with some value, right? But see, as like anything, all good things come to an end, right? If you can't get to it, or as John's put it, the cloud provider got damaged or goes out of business, you're out of business, right? So that's not good. Now we're talking about backing up or retrieval. How long does it take to restore the data before you get everything back onto your system so you can get back into business, right? This is why imaging is so great, because you snap that image on from whatever date that you stored it at, you restore your backup data from one of your multiple drives that you have locally or your NAS, and then you're back to where you are on your desktop. You're good to go. You're back in business in under an hour. You can't beat that. Then, of course, there's ransomware. Yes. Encrypt your drive, you're screwed. It doesn't really matter. Get a new hard drive, put a new image on, you're good to go. Cloud backup is...
I'm going to call my backup ransomware.
There you go. That's a great idea. What's great about this is the fact that cloud backups, since they have built-in versioning, actually, if all the files that get encrypted, of course, I would just redo the OS, because you don't know where these, how they've affected the OS in any way, shape, or form. But you can actually restore the files through the versioning process and restore all the encrypted files from cloud backups, which are really nice.
You got much more to go.
Nope. Synergy, do offline, online, both.
Okay.
Do both. It's a harmony based on years of experience. Do both. Don't trust what's online and the fact that you can get it. Trust that you have it offline, local, imaged, backup, accessible. Just works. It's in your hands. Or pay. And literally, though that dollar mark is correct, okay? If you're going to get something off of a hard drive or a NAS, you'll pay between easily $1,200, $1,400, $1,700 to several thousand, depending on how fast you want it. I mean...
Upwards of $10,000.
Yeah. No. That's they've actually come down.
That's what I said, prices have dropped.
Yeah, because when I originally started doing this, a single hard drive you could probably get $2,000 for, right? Originally, when we were charging for it. Then they dropped significantly to $1,200, and then they bounced back up to around $1,700. So.
As far as improving my backup process, right now it's SD cards, SD drives. Would you recommend go to a Blu-ray writer?
If you're storing stuff long-term, obviously, depending upon how much data that you're, dealing with on your USB sticks, right? You can get dual layer DVDs, which are 8 gig, or you can do, of course, Blu-ray long term. Just have a Blu-ray reader and store your data, right? Of course, you can do it on hard drives. That's fine too.
But with a magnetic hard drive, you still have the same problem where you've got to refresh it or something.
No.
every few years.
Nope. Nope.
You trust like a mechanical magnetic hard drive to sit on a shelf for...
Sometimes they don't start up or they'll screw up. That's why you have more than one. And they're cheap. I mean, you can buy, a 2 terabyte drive, 3 terabyte, for between $75, right? I mean,
The shelf life on them is like 15 to 20 years.
yeah. See, the problem is between the 5 terabytes and up, right? 5 to the 8s and 10 terabytes now. See, they're all filled with helium so that they fly closer to the platter, right? Yeah, it is awesome. But it's also, they have a higher error rate. So, like a 10 terabyte is as John would say, 20 terabytes because the bit error rate is so high. So, but it's less on the older ones because they're more stable because the density isn't so.
Do they have new pieces of grade to replace the heat?
No.
know that because you can tunnel.
We'll see if this works. It does not look like it is. Yeah, I actually don't have a whole lot. Well, that would explain it.
Because why even start here?
Hey. Okay. So my name is Sam Falvo. I'm the person who typically does the Kestrel stuff, but I don't have anything Kestrel related because I'm just taking a break from it right now. And in fact, somewhat relevant to that, I wanted to write a Space Invaders clone for the Kestrel 2DX. And in coming up with thinking about how to write the game or how to encode the rules, I found myself writing code which was very APL-ish in nature. I would end up writing things like, if the vector comprising of the tail ends of all these different rows contains, at least one alien in it, then I know that the aliens have reached the far end of the screen, and then I should just, step them down one and march them in the opposite direction, that sort of thing. And I found myself, as I tried to transcribe that logic into Forth, I found myself pining for having the ability to express the game logic in a single line of code, which APL is quite well known for. So that kind of brought my mind back to a project that is not mine. It is actually from Bob Armstrong. Bob Armstrong is a software developer who is well-rooted in the APL and the K communities. And I guess relatively recently, not necessarily in the last couple of years, but I know he's been working on this particular project for quite a while now, but in relative terms, this is his newest project, I think. He has a project called Cozy, which he transcribed into Riva Forth. Cozy itself actually goes back to, forgive me, Bob, I'm probably misremembering, but at least the early 80s, when he wrote it in actual APL. And then later transcribed it into K, which is Arthur Whitney's derivative of APL, and now into Riva Forth. And what Cozy is basically, it's a vocabulary written in Forth, as you might imagine, which implements a large subset of the vector processing words or functionality that you would find in something like K or APL. And by which I mean you could actually write vectors. You can have, for instance, I open paren 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, close paren I, and that would actually put a vector 5 long into memory, and with that you can actually do vector mathematics on it, or you can iterate over each element, that sort of thing. And that's kind of what I wanted for writing my particular game. I knew it would not run very fast, but I didn't care about that. I just wanted it to be correct. I wanted to know, get it working first and then optimize later, that sort of thing. And so I started studying the code for Cozy, and with my specific interests in mind, my connection has timed out apparently. So yeah, lovely. Yeah. Unfortunately, it won't allow me to do that because come on.
By the way, pickdog.org, it's a shadow of its former self, but it's fun.
Here we go. So this is basically the source code. It is up on GitHub. I'm going to zoom in here. And as you can see, it's somewhat unconventional. It's definitely not ANSI Forth. It is Riva Forth is itself a derivative of Retro Forth. So it has a lot of Retro Forth style legacy to it. For example, the vertical bar instead of the backslash to indicate a comment. But to any competent Forth programmer, when you look at this, it's very obvious things work. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to study this code so that I could kind of shamelessly steal from it. And as I was getting into this, I was realizing more and more that, oh gosh, this thing is, when I scroll down here, like for example, where am I looking at here? So there's various. So here's where it starts talking about the headers and such that describe it in memory, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit. Generic memory allocation, accessing individual elements, and I'm kind of breezing through this deliberately, but I'll go back to some of this stuff later. And then, like, as soon as like, very small number of lines of code later, we're starting to describe things like nil. And then generic cell vectors. And then from there, we're going on to the various different types, of one of which is the integers. Later on down the line, and so on and so forth, there's strings and so forth. And it turns out that when you're trying to do real-world programming, not just programming games or whatever, what's the number one thing that you're going to be dealing with? Strings and quantities of integers and stuff like that. So I'm looking at this, and I'm realizing, especially when I scroll all the way to the bottom of the listing here, and there's a lot of headers and include files and stuff like that, but this is the guts of everything, and it's less than 1,700 lines of code, including comments, including white space. In absolute terms, compared to most Forth libraries, this is gargantuan in size. But compared to, for instance, an actual implementation of APL, this is diminutively small. So I'm actually kind of, especially for the Kestrel 3, not so much the Kestrel 2DX, because I don't have the memory for it. But with the Kestrel 3, I'm kind of interested in porting the guts of Cozy and actually incorporating it into the Forth environment that is going to run on the Kestrel 3. If I can swing it, I might also do the user interface part, because Cozy is not just the vector facilities, it's also the workspace environment that is largely borrowed from original APL. All right, so I'm going to try to, so I've been studying this code for just about a week now. And so I'll kind of start here. This for constant head number. This is describing a prefix to a vector of stuff. Whatever that stuff may be, doesn't really matter. They all have a common header to them. And this header is what allows you to mix and match types dynamically at runtime. This is what makes it dynamically typed, if you will. You have a couple of accessors here, which I'm not entirely sure the exact layout. It's actually documented on Bob's website if you follow through the links enough. But long story short, when you actually allocate a new vector in memory, what you're doing is you're basically you're making space for that header, plus including all the amount of bytes needed to allocate the body of the vector. You just allocate it and then zero fill it with default values, because otherwise you'll end up with a vector full of random data. He has a convenience word here, iNumber. You'll see this frequently. Basically, this is an array accessor. But then we see down here, like vresize. This is used for when you create a static vector in source code, like the I open paren and then the stuff there. That actually fills, the way Cozy works is it actually fills in a statically allocated vector of about 100 or so integers, or 100 cells, thereabouts. And then it basically copies that into dynamically allocated space using this vresize, which is kind of convenient. IX is interesting. This is the core of accessing a vector element. And basically what this does, this is the magic line right here. The top line is basically error checking. But what this does is it uses modulo to constrain your array index here to the number of items that's actually in the array. So if you happen to have a vector of 1 and you're applying this vector, say you're adding this to a vector of 8, for example, it'll actually attempt to index this one length vector using indices 0 through 7, but it will always end up accessing that one single element. So if you're familiar, for example, with Chuck Moore's circular stacks, it basically behaves in a similar way. So you end up using, if you pass in a 3-length vector, it'll go 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. It'll keep looping over your source vector that way. And a lot of what this allows is, for example, like I was saying, if I want to take the sum over items within, a particular row of Space Invaders, and I want to say, I want to make sure that that's 0, otherwise it's the end of the game, then I can say 0 equals, the name of that vector, and it will attempt to compare 0 across that entire length of vector, and then I sum the results from that. I don't have to pre-allocate a length of 40 or whatever zeros first. Like the modulo means that I can work around that. In terms of memory management, it is reference counted. This is some of the logic that goes into that. And I'm sure that I probably breezed over this because my mouse pad is not behaving quite right. But when you create an object, now Cozy, when you first create an object, creates it with a reference count of 0 initially. That's one thing that I don't like. Typically when I use reference counting, I always create it with a reference count of 1 just to be on the safe side. But in practice, I guess it doesn't really matter because when you actually go to store it or how he has his stack primitives, that ends up getting accounted for. So for example, when you look in dupe plus, for example, it's a reference incrementing version of dupe, meaning once you duplicate it, you increment the reference count. Likewise with this reference counted version of over, does the same thing. And the idea is, if you no longer have a reference to it, you execute this another word, which I believe is, I want to say ref minus. I can't really find it right now, but it may be further down in the source code. But there is a word that actually releases a reference count, and once it reaches 0, it will properly deallocate that particular vector. Now this particular, this vdupe is interesting. Returns a copy of an object. Now in APL, a vector is not a reference type. So you could have a vector of 256 integers, and if you want to make a copy of it, say A equals B or A becomes B or whatever, it will actually create a copy of all 256 elements. This is actually something of a performance sink. So if you're doing high response time programming like video games, like my interest is, this would actually be a performance killer. For scientific work, for financial work, it's not really a big issue because your vectors are going to be so long anyway that the time spent copying versus the time spent actually processing them is going to be much more to your favor. So I'm going to try to experiment with reference types in my particular application. So here's a short word, _I. You'll see this a lot in Bob's example code. Basically what this does is this takes a single integer and wraps it into a length 1 vector, basically. This is more of a convenience word because a lot of these words only accept vectors as inputs. Enclosing and disenclosing. This is kind of hard to explain without really knowing more about the APL's original way of structuring memory, but basically what this allows you to have is a vector of references to other vectors. This is how you form more general data types. For example, I can have, as my first couple of elements, I can have a username, a password, an email address, and a person's phone number, for example, right? So all of those are different types. They can be different lengths. And in a vector language, typically this would be like a hard-coded rectangular array, that sort of thing. And the way the original APLs worked around that is by what's called boxing or enclosing. This is that exact same kind of logic, but in the K programming environment, this is very implicit. So you still have enclosing and disclosing, it's just happening behind the scenes. And this is the logic that kind of makes that happen. For example, here's enclose atom. Basically, it does a check to see if it is in fact, if it is an atom, then go ahead and enclose it. Otherwise, just leave it as is, basically. Here we go, reference decrementing. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is actually a fairly sophisticated chunk of code because when you have references to other references, what happens when that root level reference reaches 0? Right? You have to go through, before you deallocate that initial vector, you also have to deallocate, or at least dereference, all the children nodes as well. And this can happen recursively. And so because this happens recursively, you end up with a fairly sophisticated chunk of code. Not very many lines, but if it takes some study to actually figure out what's going on. So then we've got a chunk of code that's relevant to temporary parameters. He has parameters like T0, T1. These are just variables, basically, that you can assign to. They're like Chuck Moore's A register, so to speak, in a certain sort of sense. And as you can see here, it is interesting that whatever was originally in T0, when you assign to it, it automatically gets dereferenced. We then reference the object that's currently on the stack, and then we stuff it into memory. Right? So this way here, you don't have to manually do reference counting and that sort of thing. You'll see references in Bob's source code, for example. You'll see references to R0 and things like that. Same idea. T0, T1, and R all have the same basic behaviors. Very commonly used constants, just like how originally in fourth you have constant 0, constant 1, constant -1, that sort of thing. These are the same things, but they are vectorized. So you have I0, I1, and I-1. And here's where the magic really happens. We've got, I haven't quite fully decoded how the naming convention here, but each M and each D refers to a monadic or dyadic function that you want to apply to every item in a vector or a pair of vectors. Monadic referring to single parameter, and dyadic referring to taking two parameters. And we see that here in the monadic case, we take one particular vector that we want to operate on, and in the dyadic, we see that we take two particular items on this as inputs. And what we see is we've got this IC fetch that's being used. Here we've got IC fetch being used on both the right hand and the left hand vectors being used before we execute our function. And then based on that, we compose a new vector accordingly. That new vector is initialized here. And there's similar logic up here if you study it. For example, we duplicate. Basically use vdup to do the duplication there. It should be interesting to note, in the dyadic case, the resulting vector is always the longer of the left hand or the right hand vector. This makes sense because when you iterate over the loop, that modulo indexing will automatically extend the short vector to fit the long vector. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier. So I think the MCR and the DCR, well, I explained the M and the D. The C part of the name, that middle part there, that refers to a generic cell. So these functions will work with any cell-sized vector of data. The I part refers to integers. Later on, he also has functions for strings as well, text strings, which are basically bite-sized units. So here's the code that I was talking about when you say I open paren. This is actually a forward parsing word. And when you execute it, it basically checks to see, is it the closing token? And if not, interpret it as a number and stuff it into a particular vector. But the thing is when you look at the initial vector, if I'm understanding this correctly, he's allocating 100 kilobytes for the vector up front, which should be plenty of memory space for any reasonable sized literal vector. When he's done with that, he will resize that vector back down to something more suitable for the vector that you actually gave it. So row is, this is a common idiom in virtually all APLs, both APL itself, APL2, J, and K, all have this symbol or something like it called row. And its purpose is to tell you how big this vector is, how many elements are actually stored in that particular list. In actual APL, it can also be used to tell you the shape. In fact, you'll hear it referred to as shape. And its result will actually be itself an array. It's a 2 by 3 by 4 matrix, for example, cubical matrix. K doesn't really deal with that. And likewise, COSI doesn't deal with that either. It greatly simplifies the problem space to just dealing with lists of lists. And so since you're dealing with lists, that implies that you only have one dimension to think about at any given time. So in this case, row just returns a very simple integer on the stack. Now, these are operations that make use of the each operators that I was telling you earlier. So if I have an integer vector, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and I have another vector 2, 2, 2, for example, and I add these are the operators that I want to use. And what this does is this basically binds fourth's built-in plus operator using each dir, in this case, to compute the vector sum of these two operands. And there's plus, minus, multiply, divide as well, modulus, minimum and maximum as well. Here's a bit of syntax that, as far as I'm aware, is unique to Riva, and that is you can define multiple synonyms for the same point in the code, the actual same definition. There's a different part of the source code which confuses me, where he uses colon, the name of the word, colon, and then a number. That kind of confuses me a little bit. It seems to, what's the word I'm looking for? It seems to contradict my interpretation here. So I'm not entirely sure yet how that works. But long story short, and again, here we're saying, check for equality between element-wise on the integers, that sort of thing. So yeah, I've only been studying this for a couple of days now. I'm not like an expert at this code at all. Concatenates integer vectors. So this is code that will take two integer vectors and will splice them together into a single list. And there are character equivalents of this as well, CL, I believe, that will do the same, which is incredibly useful for text processing and things like that. And speaking of which, there's our byte vector creator. And we have IB fetch and IB store, same idea here. And in this particular dialect, S quote is being used as the word that creates a string vector. S quote, unfortunately, is already taken by ANSI forth, so my port of this will probably have to change the name of this word, which is unfortunate. But at the same time, it'd be also very convenient to go back to just using quote as well, because I kind of miss that. $quote. $quote's another option as well, yeah. Symbols are basically internalized strings. They're basically a very specialized form of strings in a sense, I believe. And then we get back down here to a bunch of vector simcat. I believe this is concatenation. Yeah, so da-da-da. Yep, so he's adding the lengths of both vectors here. And down here, I'm sure we'll find, oh, I thought I would see comma CL, but maybe that's in an included file somewhere else. But he does have, a bunch of different emitters and outputters and things like that, convenience functions. And he also has definitions as well for floating point as well. But basically, you look at this and it's, all of this has a very certain sort of structure to it. It's very uniform structure is what I'm trying to get at. And for any given particular type of vector, the code has the same basic shape, same basic iteration mechanisms, the same basic memory management tools, that sort of thing. Here's IOTA, which in APL is popular because basically this is how you generate numbers from 0 to some number, which is often used as initialization code for building out matrices and that sort of thing. And as you can see, basically all this does is it just initializes a vector of integers of certain size, and it just fills it in with sequentially incrementing numbers. There's our dyadic and monadic functions in the floating point domain, various min-max, that sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure what this stuff is for. I haven't quite gotten this far yet. I think what this is happening here is basically if you give it a generic operation, it will attempt to determine which accessor to use based on the type of vector. So this is a generic fetch function, for example. Yeah, and then here we have each M, which is probably the version of each that you'd want to use in the general case. And what we find here, over execute loop drop refs. Okay, yeah. So this is basically just doing the same thing that this more specialized each M stuff happens to be doing up above. Exactly why this is broken out, I'm not quite entirely sure. I haven't gotten that far yet, as you can tell. Integer functions, floating functions. Again, this kind of looks like the code that will select the appropriate operation depending on the specific type of vector that you're working with. And then here's a different variant of each M. This actually appears quite frequently. So yeah, okay. So here we're actually looking to see, we're actually starting to dispatch on specific types now. So this is probably the topmost item that you'd want to use if you wanted to apply a function to each item without concern for specific types used in vectors. And then each is the dyadic version of that, by the looks of it. This is the atomic apply. I think this created a bit of I won't say controversy, but certainly some discussion on the fourth mailing list recently. And I think what this does is it basically iterates and recurses into lists until it finds a non-list item, and then it applies a function. So you could say, I want to execute the word double, for example, to multiply something by 2. on an arbitrarily deep set of lists, for example. That I believe that's how this code works. And then there's the dyadic version of that as well. And I think the rest of this is more general purpose accessors, iterators, that sort of thing. I'm not quite sure how these across, I think some of these are scans as well, if you're familiar with APL scans, that basically is a running sum instead of, so typically when you do a reduction on something, it's like inserting a plus op, say add reduction. You're basically saying if I've got this vector of 4 items, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's like saying 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, right? A scan is a vectorized version of that where you start with just 1, then you compute 1 plus 2, then you compute 1 plus 2 plus 3, and then 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is your final item. So yeah, so here's our initial definitions for scan, I guess. So yeah, this is actually relatively clean code. I mean, if you're not familiar with the concepts of APL, this could certainly seem very opaque. But since learning J and myself some years ago, I understand a lot of the idioms that's being used here. The pieces that I still have the most uncertainty about is, for example, when I see a large body of code like this, like SS, lower swap, colon, CSS, you know, like I have to sit here and I have to basically parse through this code and actually just kind of sit there and study it and see what it actually is doing. Like it says here, modeled on K's underscore SS function. Well, I don't know K, so I have to kind of reverse engineer that. But there are certain things in here that do stand out to me as well. I've actually tried to apply what I've learned to my own code, and I hope that I can illustrate that here. So this is code that I've written in G4. There we go. Let me turn off syntax so that you can actually see it. So basically this is, and again, this is not my attempt to replace Cozy or anything like that. This is just my attempt to better understand by copying, basically. And so I have a different length header. I've got 3 cells instead of 4. Reference count, the size of each element in bits, and then the length of the vector in elements. You multiply those two and then divide by 8, and that tells you how many bytes the vector basically is, not including the header of this as well. And it's basically the same idea. I've got some G4 specifics, valloc, vfree, that sort of thing. I do differ from Bob's code in that when I construct a statically allocated vector, I do so at here. I do not dynamically allocate a vector first. So that if you see references to here and comma and all that other stuff, that's where all of that is happening. And then I execute restore to free the memory when I'm done using it. I have support for integers. I've got support for what I call characters, which are just 8-bit bytes, but that are not intended to be interpreted as a string. And then I've got vquote and vtick to serve as vectors for strings. And then I've got the ability to dynamically create a vector. I've got some reference counting logic. And then that's basically as far as I got. So that's kind of the Cozy code in a nutshell. Not terribly exciting, I guess, because this is all black magic that happens behind the scenes. but it is the very foundation and the very core of what makes cozy as a vector environment and forth interesting. And it's also very interesting because if you want to understand how APL works or how K works or something like that, this is actually very approachable code. Whereas if you wanted to look at off-the-shelf stuff, you're looking at C code, which is incredibly dense and written by APL programmers. So there's like no white space to help guide you in reading the corresponding C code. So so this is just my attempt at cloning it for my own understanding. Any questions? Looks like I'm done then. Cool. All right. There's a proposition for breaking briefly. Yep.
All the way over. Okay. We're good. So I apologize if this is kind of like a raw brain dump. I don't have any slides, and feel free to heckle in the middle because that kind of helps with So
Who are you?
I'm Andreas Wagner, and I was going to maybe demonstrate a little bit how one writes a FIFO style fourth, because some people asked for more substantial examples of it, and I just wanted to demonstrate a bit of that, and also where I'm going with it, and my current thoughts on it, and things that I've changed from my previous talk on FIFO-based fourth, FIFO-style fourth. So in my previous in my previous talk, I had fourth words. So I had words consume elements from the far end of the FIFO and produce closer to the I had them consume from the far end of the FIFO and produce near the words on the terminal input. So here I would consume 2 and then 2 and then multiply would consume 2 and then consume 2 and then produce the result over here. But then I tried to so I could do that. So here a comma I'm using as literal, as the word literal. So I can do this. Wait, first I need to upload upload this, which just redefines words to be FIFO style. With this word, if I wanted to do, say, have 3 numbers, key, maybe I have 4 numbers, and I wanted to turn those into, say, I wanted to convert those from ASCII to integer numbers, and then I would need to subtract a hex value of 30 from each one, hex value of 30 from each one, and then I don't want to produce this number hex number 30 over to the far end of the FIFO, because then I can't subtract 30 from each one, 30 from each one. So that presents a bit that at first I was trying to do things of having multiple FIFOs, references to other FIFOs, producing and consuming unnecessarily. But then I thought, well, I could just flip the FIFO and have consume values near the word definition, and produce on the far end, because we tend to consume for now and produce for later. So it would make sense to produce to the far end of the FIFO and consume in the immediate location, in the near location of the FIFO. So I could do just 30 minus, or 30 minus, 30 minus. And this would, whoops, should I upload it? So I did, I forgot, key this produces, so then I have 1, 2, 3. So I have number 0. It's kind of hard to see here, but because of the way the stack is printed, but I have numbers 0. I think I missed something. Anyway, just a moment. So let's say I have key. Okay, so if I have the numbers the ASCII characters 0, 1, 2, and 3, then I can just I could define a word ASCII to digit, for instance, and that would just be 30 minus, and I could do long for and then I just have the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3. I don't need to do any stack juggling here to do this. I don't need to compile it to an array or anything like that. And I also don't need to come up with a C fetch plus analog to do this. And it means I don't really need to be so concerned with stack depth. I can just produce values for later to the bottom of to the far end of the FIFO, and then when it comes around to it, I can consume values close to the word in the terminal buffer. So yeah, there's some other things I want to mention. I have the note on my phone, things I want to talk about. So yeah, so this is more concatenative than it was in the earlier talk, because it's closer to applying through juxtaposition of parameters. So I think producing to the far end and consuming close to the word is the way to is the way the FIFO should be ordered. It should be flipped from my previous talk. So what else do I want to talk about? Yeah, so I still use, I only need one word now to do, I don't need I only need a produce word now. The consume is just pop. And okay, so I can do that. Yeah, and something I also do now is I don't, I'm starting to think that I don't need to have a dichotomy between dictionary and parameter stack so much anymore. And often what I do is I just inline, if I have a string, like an ASCII string, I just inline the bytes into the FIFO, and I don't put them in pad. I just inline them into the FIFO, sort of like I did here. And yeah, I don't need to use a separate pad and then have a reference to it. So I've been thinking I'm sort of just slicing up the FIFO into factors, as I will show later in my 6-level graphics demo. And I'm thinking I could just persist parts of the FIFO and call that the dictionary. So at the far end of the FIFO, I could just move the pointer over and just persist that part of the FIFO, and my parameter or stack would just be the unpersisted part of the dictionary, which is still in a state of flux, and I can just, persist it by moving the start of FIFO pointer, and that would be basically my dictionary pointer. No need for both of those. So I've also been thinking about, the return stack. I'm still using, this is on ME McCrisp Stellaris 4th on a PSOC 5LP. But in my own FIFO-based 4th from scratch, I'm thinking maybe the return stack could also be replaced with something not a stack, like a FIFO. And but how would that work? So I thought in the previous talk I said that would be pretty much lazy, that would lend itself well to lazy evaluation. And that would be I think it'd be interesting to do that in 4th, because that would mean essentially optimizing. I could, for instance, write an optimizing assembler that sort of optimizes at runtime in a way. And so I started thinking about how would things be different this way. So if I have 3 plus, 3 plus, in 4th we might consider the plus to be high level and the dot to be high level, and 3 and 3 are low level literals. But what if we took 3 and 3 as the name of the word, and plus as what what 3 and 3 point to? And then if we have 3 and 3, we can just it's sort of like more of a memoizable value. We can just reference 3, 3 plus, and then I guess what I'm saying is that you can traverse unambiguously from the leaves of a tree to up to the branches, but from a branch down to the leaves, that's not that's ambiguous. So I was thinking maybe I should just have 3, 3 as the name of the word, and that and consider plus to be low level. This is sort of how capability-based security also sort of flips the arrow of abstraction, because it gives much higher granularity that way, and improves security that way. So I was, so I think I sort of took for granted that maybe that 3 and 3 must be low level because they're simpler or whatever. But if you think about it, high level or plus is sort of like if you think about what high level and low level actually means, which I never really thought about much before. But high level is, I guess you could think of it as something you can communicate with others easily. It's something it's easily communicatable, it's extensible, and it's shared common ground between entities or something. And that applies more to, in a way, to literal, concrete, reified literals, and it's more common ground. There's more common ground with 3, 3 than there is with plus. It's more like plus is like a internal. If you think of it like with people, it's like an internal direct experience of something is less easily communicated than a literal, concrete expression or so. So that's a bit, So So I don't know, there's something else I want to talk about. Check my notes real quick. Yeah, so I've been applying this sort of like inverted notion of abstraction to logic synthesis on the PSOC 5LP, which I have right here, which is like it has a ARM Cortex M3. It has a UDB array, which is something like a CPLD, and it has a analog fabric, which is something like a field programmable analog array. And I've been applying it to, I've been applying the inverted notion of abstraction to that. I mapped out pretty much the digital logic fabric. I figured out how that works. That was on document. This is like a ginormous ASCII diagram, switching matrix diagram, with the mini map, yes. And but it has a very simple, elegant formula. Cypress came up with a very simple, elegant way of mapping the logic fabric into memory. Unlike a lot of FPGAs, this is all mapped into memory, the entire logic fabric, every switch. So you can access it from the ARM Cortex M3, and you can configure it from the ARM Cortex M3 while it's running. You can reconfigure it while it's running, and so on. So I was thinking, so there's a lot of, there are many literals in a Boolean expression. There are many literals in the logic fabric available, truth and complement. There's a lot of those, but there are only two literals, truth and complement. There's many instances of them. So I view truth and complement as being the two branches coming from the root, rather than as being leaves of the tree, and as the fabric itself being the root. I view truth and complement as essentially coming from the root, and it's sort of like an inverted notion of abstraction, I guess. But it sort of helps with sort of a lazy evaluation of and memoizing and avoiding recomputing expressions that are arbitrary but have already been computed or so. Yeah. I don't think there's anything else, but that I want to talk about. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I've been working on. But yeah, and then I have this. I wanted to do a Sixel graphics demo, which I haven't finished yet. But yeah, basically, I'm just FIFOs are really good for filtering, and I thought it would be fun to do a little oscilloscope, which sources from an ADC on a microcontroller and displays to Sixel graphics. And you can fit in the terminal, and it would filter samples like grep. Where each sample would be on one line, and that would sort of make up a waveform. It's sort of a waterfall format, and you could filter it as if you were filtering a text file with grep. You could annotate each sample with trigger or phase or an amplitude or something like that, and filter it, do low pass, high pass, band pass, trigger, filter, whatever. I haven't actually finished this, so I was going to talk about this today, but I sort of ran out of time. But it does display Sixel graphics in the terminal, just not an oscilloscope. And I didn't get the ADC working, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions or comments or worldviews?
Like a filter on a waterfall?
Yeah, so I have like an oscilloscope, it's usually a horizontal waveform, but I thought if I want this to be like an easy-to-use, interactive, either Unix command line or fourth command line sort of tool, I would have it as a vertical,
Going like this, right?
going like that, yeah, a vertical waveform, and then I could just, each line of the waveform is a sample,
Right.
and I can add a little bit of metadata to each sample, like this is the phase or the amplitude, and then trigger on patterns or so, and I could just filter it as if I'm filtering with grep, and it would be very...
Even would even be more better.
Yeah.
Is when you said waterfall, I was thinking, God, I worked on the sonar receivers.
Yeah?
And that's how they show it. It's waterfall.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to know if tones are happening, you could have something like that where, I see, there's an energy for a certain amount of time over a certain frequency range. I can trigger on that or whatever
Yeah.
you want. That's a pretty good thing to be able to do, and you're using the FIFO, right?
Yeah, the
So
FIFO.
which means you just keep pumping,
Yeah.
take your signal, run it through a FFT, then pump the output into this filter. So as it sees, God, you could do that for, a whole lot of applications. Even earthquake, looking for certain frequencies
Yeah.
in earthquakes, or whatever, sound signatures.
Yeah.
Radio signatures. I mean, that's very, very, very nice idea, having that input as a FIFO, and then you just define your filter.
Yeah. And you can factor these filters as fourth words. You can slice up the samples themselves as patterns, which you can pull out into a fourth word,
Yes.
for instance. Yeah.
So you can say, I see something. That's like a, spit it out, a matched filter. You guys ever hear of that? Hello, wake up, you putzes.
No, I haven't.
Good. Grandpa here's still asleep. Yes. So what I'm saying is, match filter uses an FFT type thing where you look for certain patterns,
Yeah.
and then when you see them, you can get enough, even in a noisy environment. So if this thing pokes up above the noise floor, you can say, something interesting has happened. I
Yeah.
should do something. Let somebody know that, hey, something has happened.
Yeah.
This thing could be something bad is happening.
Yeah.
Like an accelerometer on a bearing, where you just look at the signal coming out, and if the bearing goes bad, you'll get a funky signal coming out.
Yeah.
And you can use that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Also, in my fourth, my word names are not just flat text strings. They can be fourth code themselves. So you could have a word named something, not just a literal string earthquake, but whatever pattern, whatever piece of code would detect an earthquake would be the name of your word.
Right. Or I can't imagine. Well, I can't go too much detail about sonar receivers, but looking for particular signals
Yeah.
would be nice to have, so that because those things, that's the most important part in a submarine, is the sonar
Yeah.
guy, because he's the guy that's like right off of the control room, and sonar men are treated with a great deal of respect,
Yeah.
because they're the eyes that look out in a submarine.
Yeah.
So,
Tink?
Do everybody know what these codes are doing?
What this code is doing?
Could you show me that's what the last 6 pals do?
Oh, the last.
Basically, you do the red 6 pals, right? Then you print out the
Yeah.
23, 32, and 3D, right?
Yeah, you can just cat. It's like ANSI escape codes for.
Let me see. So black L, green L, black L.
We can.
What happens when you execute samples?
When I execute it, well, that was going to actually source from the ADC, but it's not doing that right now. It's just putting a bar of black pixels, a single green pixel, and then another bar of black pixels, but right now it's not actually sourcing from the ADC to move where the green pixel is.
Let me see. Go way back up a little bit. For example, look at the code for black. Okay. You get black is 23, 30, 3B,
Yeah.
23. That's 30 is the 0, right?
Yeah, 23 is like a hash character, and it's
Hash 0, 3B. 3B is
semicolon.
semicolon.
Yeah.
So when you have a black and you execute black sextile, so basically it emits 23, 30, 30, and 3D.
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, these all go in the comma is actually not a comma compiler here.
Right.
That puts it on the back of the FIFO, yeah.
You insert that into your platform.
Yeah.
And then when you execute sextile, which is pick the 23 and emit it, 30 emit it, and 3D.
Yeah, this is just dumping everything that's in the parameter stack onto the screen, and yeah, I can just run it real quick. Still, if it's working at the moment. Yeah, so just like displayed some like graphics thing. I don't know what this artifact is, but bar of green pixels, black on either side. Yeah, there's like I have this like text file all about sixels, which you can probably find somewhere online. Original URL is gone, but it's nice to have graphics in your terminal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Any other questions, or I think we're.
Get back in there and sell, buy, with thinking.
Thank you. All right.
Anything else this week?
Anything else?
This month, this year. We'll be back in April. Yes, we will.
I think I just pressed the mute button.
Happy March.
I was like,
springtime.
it's fine.